There is my one slide, literally for all seminars, all presentations. If there's time, I'll explain something about it. I begin as instructed, because I always do what I'm told. My takeaway message is that scholarship is a toxic asset. Its value bears no relationship to its real substance. Working out what is the real substance and the relationship between its worth is difficult. Obviously, those here have a real worth which is considerably greater than the extent to which they've been valued, both absolutely and relative to one another. And how to work out this relationship between the real value and the toxic value of our scholarship is as much an art as it is a science. And I will try and illustrate this takeaway message with a special case of social policy. The second instruction was to relate to the book. My initial toxic asset was about 35,000 words of text for a comparative study for UNRIS, United Nations Research Institute on Social Development. I've unbundled this asset and repackaged it, but subject to the scrutiny of the regulators, that's our volume editors. The main thrust of the larger paper was to provide a framework for a large research program looking at the development of social policy in developing countries and emerging economies. My answer was that we should go for a marriage between something called the developmental welfare state and something called the public sector system of provision. That's in the other paper. That's been thrown away for these purposes. But along the way, in creating this larger asset, there was devaluation, or an attempt to devalue the value of another asset, that is the continuing dominant toxic asset in the field of social policy, something called the welfare regime approach, associated with someone called Esping Anderson. So what I've tried to do then, to meet the requirements of the regulator, is to originate and distribute my original asset to deal with the workshop themes through a debt swap with the editors. I'm trying to be funny, but obviously failing miserably. I said Simon was not allowed to grimace or make negative comments because I'm seeing him directly. There we go. In a way, I thought of another way of looking at this. I'm also dealing with something which might be called, perhaps you hear it here for the first time, something called financialization fetishism. And this is like commodity fetishism in some respects, and deviates between two extremes. One is where someone sees fetishism everywhere, and therefore doesn't see it at all. And the other extreme is they don't see it at all, and these obviously reflect very different views about what the nature of fetishism, financialization fetishism, is. Okay, in a way then what my paper is about is in what way is the welfare regime approach a product of neoliberalism without itself being neoliberal itself, as I will explain, and how does its continuing dominance in the scholarship of social policy reflect or not whether crisis is systemic, conjunctural, or policy-made. That's my attempt to, as I say, deal with the debt from my own particular asset. All of us will be very familiar with this in a comparative context of the upheavals within economics. We've had a Marxist revolution, the Keynesian revolution, the monetarist counter-revolution. These, I think, we probably would all agree, respond to or correspond or reflect to some degree or other economic developments. But equally, currently, we have appear to have a crisis of economics without any corresponding revolution within the field of economics itself. By the way, I would argue, in passing, that the issue about economics and its heterodox alternatives is not about whether we're able to predict crises or not, but whether we have developed the means to understand crises. And I think in this respect, the heterodox concept of financialization is one which was put forward, or at least originally put forward prior to the crisis, and in a sense there's a parallel here with value theory and the relationship between Ricardo and Marx. Both Ricardos, possibly. So, again, to pose my question once more in more general terms, what I'm concerned with is what is the nature of the system of scholarship under neoliberalism, without all scholarships, of course, being neoliberal itself, even though, and in particular I'm going to be focused on that scholarship which is concerned with the nature of neoliberalism. And I need to begin with what I think are 6 ground rules, most of which have already been covered extensively and over which we probably will all disagree to a greater or lesser extent. The first one is, what was the source of the post-war boom? And my answer is the post-war boom was a consequence of the internationalization of productive capital and the extensive role of state intervention in promoting both that and the restructuring of domestic capital. The state was also heavily involved in restructuring social reproduction, most obviously in the context of the welfare state, and the big broad context in which this all happened is one of US hegemony with a global politics of Cold War conflict. That's my first big ground rule. My second big ground rule is that neoliberalism is a separate stage of capitalism, marked by what I call the extensive and intensive of financialization of both economic and social restructuring and reproduction. Thirdly, financialization has many forms and is highly uneven in incidence across countries and sectors and financial systems. But in addition, even if it weren't uneven, the same incidence of financialization would have differential impact upon economic and social reproduction. So my conclusion is that both the incidence and the impact of financialization is a word I like a lot, that doesn't originate with me, of course, is that the incidence and impact of financialization is highly variegated. Then my fourth groundwork point is that this is a key feature of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is itself variegated and not a homogenizing force, if you like, because, not despite, financialization is at the core of neoliberalism, and even I would go so far as to say its defining characteristic insofar as neoliberalism is characterized by the promotion of private capital in general by the state, which is what we're familiar with, but of finance in particular to the fore. My fifth big ground rule is that neoliberalism has gone through 2 phases, and you can't even know when it began. It's going to be difficult to agree about what phases there were of it. The first phase I would date from the beginnings of the 1980s to the start of the 1990s is what might be called a shock therapy stage, and has been called that, for example, for Latin America and Eastern Europe and so on, which was to release private capital in finance and other ways without, to some extent, any regard to the consequences. And then the second phase, which you might loosely associate with third waveism and so on, is a phase in which neoliberalism is characterized by an attempt to sustain the processes of financialization through, and to some extent in response to, the dysfunctions which were created by the first phase. And I believe this is sharply revealed by the response to the crisis of 2007-8 in terms of reforms taken by state intervention to rescue finance. And my sixth and final ground rule, and possibly the most important for my theme, is that if we are trying to understand scholarship and how it evolves under neoliberalism and possibly more generally, then we have to distinguish between the scholarship, the ideology, and the policy and practice in various different areas, either as a separate fourth factor or indeed as a combination of all these 3. They reflect a vision. And my argument is that this scholarship, ideology, and policy and practice have a shifting and inconsistent relationship to one another. And this is particularly germane for neoliberalism, where, as I think Ricardo was also arguing that the ideology of laissez-faire and leaving things to the market is in fact a mask over which considerable state intervention takes place on behalf of private capital in general and finance in particular. Okay, that's my starting point. Now I can begin. I want to begin by 5 minutes. I'm going to begin by saying something about what is the welfare regime approach. Some of you probably over familiar with this, but some of you perhaps not familiar at all. And I'm going to give 3 main points about it. The paper covers this in detailed and boring extent. 3 points and then a number of criticisms. The first is that the welfare regime approach originates in the early 1990s, interestingly at the same time as I would say, the second phase of neoliberalism, and displaces what might be called a Marxist political economy of the welfare state, associated primarily with Marxists arguing the welfare state is to be understood either as functional for capital in some sense, or is a consequence of class conflict to make gains in social reproduction. Secondly, the welfare regime approach puts forward the idea that there are 3 ideal types under which social policy and welfare is organized under capitalism. The 3 ideal types are the Scandinavian welfare state, obviously associated with Scandinavia, the Bismarckian welfare state, particularly associated with Germany, and the liberal welfare state, somewhat strangely associated, I think, with the US and the UK. Actually, the details of these need not detain us. The third point about the welfare regime approach is that it has evolved over the next 25 years or so, gathering and exposing weaknesses, in my view, even as it continues and strengthens its domination over the field of social policy. In particular, let me just go through what I think are the 4 major weaknesses of the approach. The first is that it required, as empirical work was undertaken to try and fit social policy into these 3 ideal types, the need for proliferation of ideal types to fit wider ranges of countries. And now there are 6, 7, 8, even double-figure numbers of ideal types of welfare states. Secondly, the empirical evidence shows very, very clearly that there are, even if we accept the ideal types, that particular countries have differences within themselves across the different programs of delivery of the different elements of social policy. Thirdly, the welfare regime approach has suffered from a lack of theory, and although it was originally based on something called a power resources hypothesis, in which social policy was determined by the power and resources of those pressing for or against social policy, over time, including in the work of Esping-Andersen itself, the theory underpinning the welfare regime approach has given way to empirical classification, and insofar as theory is retained, it's moved towards a more conventional and even neoliberal notion of social policy as being concerned with something called risk management of individual citizens or households. And then the last point, which I think is very important in many ways, is that there's limited capacity for the welfare regime approach to address policy, because the implications are countries are stuck into their particular types of welfare regime, and the only policy implication of that is, well, we all should become like Sweden, and that's not really a policy that's very easy to adopt. Now, the next point I want to make, and throw out a few insults as I do so, is to argue that the welfare regime approach is very much a product of the Keynesian era, even emerging in the early 1990s, as I said, overlaid then by its clash with neoliberalism, as neoliberalism was itself gathering strength or even moving into its second phase. I actually find, this is where the insult comes in, I actually find this quite typical of a lot of scholarship, particularly of that time. For example, it's true of the varieties of capitalism approach, And it's also true of regulation theory, in my view. What has happened to post-Fordism? Because what's going on is that we've gone through this Keynesian post-war boom, or so-called Keynesian post-war boom, which we've tried to understand. We begin to recognize that this Keynesianism is in clash with something else called neoliberalism, and so we're trying to modify our understanding of Keynesianism in order to understand the clash with neoliberalism, and yet the full implications or the full nature of what neoliberalism is has yet to be understood. In fact, it's quite interesting that the varieties of capitalism approach, for example, this is obviously not true of regulation theory, which with Alietta put huge emphasis on finance right from the beginning and to some extent moved away from that for a time. But what's interesting is the variety of capitalism approach doesn't even address finance in its earliest forms. I also, here's my insult, I also think that this living in the past of how do we relate the emergence of neoliberalism to its clash with Keynesianism continues to dominate much of our own thinking. And we really need to understand neoliberalism on its own terms. Moving back then to social policy, having thrown out a few insults to you, what I would also argue, although the welfare regime approach very much dominates the field of social policy, there are other tools in the social policy academic kit as well. These include the notion that the response to any sort of crisis is austerity in social policy. Nonetheless, this doesn't always materialize because of path dependence in social policy systems. There are theories of divergence of social policy regimes. There are theories of convergence of social policy regimes. Now, the most important thing about this toolkit, as I say, of which the welfare regime approach is the most prominent, is that it's been around for a long time, 20 years or more, and that actually means when anything happens, we've got a ready-made set of tools like a plumber to understand it. Oh, so this big crisis that we're having now, it's just more of the same. And so we have no reason really to reassess our mode of thinking. And in terms of my original opening around toxic assets, and from the point of view of the ground rules which I attempted to establish, what this means is that the welfare regime approach fails to take a proper account of neoliberalism as a period of capitalism with financialization at its heart. Obviously, financialization is not new with the crisis, but it is sharply revealed by it as at the heart of neoliberalism. And I don't think I need to run over this because this is what much of our discussion has been about already. It's quite clear that financialization affects economic outcomes, such as levels of employment, productivity, inequality, directly with implications for what social policy is required or able to deliver. And it's also the case, and I think this is brought out strongly by Al's contribution yesterday in terms of financialization and its relationship to working class and class conflict, is that neoliberalism, quite apart from the impact it has on social policy through its impact upon the economy and therefore social reproduction, neoliberalism also has profound effect on the form, the ways in which social policy is made, as well as the content of that social policy. So once again, I mean, we could all talk about privatization as an element in social policy, as well as the ideology of dependency, etc., all of which are profoundly influenced by the rise of the financial elite, which themselves are either strengthened or in some developing countries emerge with the processes of financialization itself. By the way, just again, because this topic came up in the previous session around productive and unproductive labour, one of the consequences of financialisation and its impact upon social policy is, on the one hand, to create productive out of unproductive labour through privatisation, for example, where you're trying to make provision of services subject to private capital where previously they were socially provided in whatever form. On the other hand, of course, this is also the creation of a huge amount of unproductive labour in the financial assets which are, or in the financial workers, who are attached to those processes of financialization. That's something which I discussed yesterday in terms of water privatization. Once again, what this means, and I would emphasize very, very strongly, is that financialization, both because of its variegated incidence and impact upon the economy, equally has an even more, if you like, a third layer of variegation around policy responses. And we can see that in all sorts of areas of provision of social policy. Actually, I'm doing rather well, I think, for time. There we go. So now let me return to the original question. I think I'll be no more than 5 or 10 minutes. Like economics, then, this social policy literature which I'm describing, the considerable dominance of this welfare regime approach, I can't really emphasize that too much. It doesn't mean there isn't another literature, but the dominance of this welfare regime approach is very, very heavy and global. Whilst like economics and this social policy literature has remained remarkably stable through the crisis, there is of course one huge mirror image difference between economics and the social policy literature. And that is, in general, and commendably, the welfare regime approach is both progressive and critical. The vast majority of those writing within this discourse would like to see a Scandinavian welfare state put into place, as opposed to economics, which is varies from either from being apologetic to vulgar apologetic for the nature of the economy. So the conclusion I want to draw from this in terms of my original toxic asset is that social policy scholarship is not a simple reflection of whether the crisis is systemic or not, although I would argue that the crisis is systemic at the economic level. It doesn't reflect simply whether it's conjunctural or not, which I would also argue is contributing to the crisis, or policy made or not. But really the nature and longevity of the welfare regime approach is a reflection of its own initial compromises around the political economy of the welfare state literature, its attempt to negotiate the clash between neoliberalism and Keynesianism from the 1990s, and, perhaps most important from my point of view, hopefully our point of view, a failure to grasp the nature of financialization as the key distinguishing aspect of neoliberalism. If you read, with a possible exception of, I've probably looked at 400 or 500 contributions on social policy over the last, 10 years, possibly even less than that. The time at which financialization, both empirically and in scholarship, has seemed to be right at the fore. With the possible exception of pensions, for obvious reasons to some degree, the social policy literature does not mention financialization at all. It's as though it does not exist. However, this, much the same, is also true of economics. That economics, or mainstream economics, will not, and in my view, cannot incorporate the notion of financialization because it is both dynamic, involves class, power, etc., all of which are unacceptable to the mainstream. But this is not true of the welfare regime approach, or indeed of literature dealing with social policy. So my argument is that unlike economics then, well, the first big issue is actually, this might actually reveal that I have nothing but toxic assets and I'm going to get thrown out of the stock exchange here of the edited book. Scholarship in this particular context, and possibly in economics itself, cannot itself be seen as evidence either for or against a systemic, conjunctural, or policy-made crisis. You have to examine the only way in which that can be said is that it misses the things that are going on, not that it reflects that there is or is not a crisis, because it could go either way. But the conclusion I would otherwise draw is that the social policy discourse is potentially open to transformation through incorporation of the role of financialization, for which my own approach would be to, as I say, go for this marriage of the developmental welfare state and the public sector system of provisional approach to welfare. But that's not really That's been sold off on another in the stock market. And so, given I've got some time left, I asked you at some point. I'll come back to this in a minute. I first of all want to point to what I consider to be a paradox in a way, which reinforces the idea that we cannot read scholarship off as a reflection, as evidence for or against the nature of the crisis itself. Because what we can see is that, in a sense, the survival both of economics and of the welfare regime approach are both based upon their theoretical, or if you like, their scholarly insulation from financialization within their theory. I mean, I don't think either of these disciplines always could survive if they actually brought in financialization. However, social policy in practice, in my view, if it's going to be at all progressive, would need to insulate itself from financialization. As a first step, there's no guarantee. I mean, it's actually worth reminding ourselves that the immediate response in the social policy arena to the crisis from 2007-2008 was a considerable expansion in social policy, which was often seen in Keynesian terms. It might have reflected part dependence. That has been rapidly clawed back across the world over the subsequent period. This, I think, also reflects, this and other things that I've said, reflects a commentary on one of the questions with which John began our conference, the nature and and it's come up again and again, is the relationship of the crisis itself to the world system. And here I do see the crisis as a crisis of the world system, but that is a world system in which the unevenness of the crisis does depend to a large extent in the era of neoliberalism on the extent to which there is insulation of national economies or even particular sectors or parts of social policy from the processes of financialization. And that's where I'm going to finish up with my one slide, my universal slide. It's about money, and it is money. This comes from generic. Yeah, generic. It comes from someone called Josiah Stamp, who I can tell you a lot about. He was the second richest man in Britain in the 1930s. He served on the board of the Bank of England. Oh, the richest in those times, again, it reflects something different, was H.M. King, who you can work out who that is. So, and I think this says it all in terms of financialization. Our job is just to fill out the details, that really he's saying that the dominance of financial, I mean there's lots of weaknesses in this too, I think you probably can't even read it, but anyway. The dominance of finance over our lives is something over which we have to take control if we even want to begin to make alternative policies. Okay.
Thank you, Ben. I expected you to participate, not the organizer. So if I can start briefly with one thing, if you'll allow me to do that, because I've prepared it beforehand, and that is, I agree overall with what you said, but I want to take issue with your use of Keynesianism, not on a semantic level, but on a meaningful level. I can remember I was recently at a meeting, and so I said that the UK deficit will go away as a result of growth. The UK deficit will go away as a result of growth as growth generates more revenue. And someone from the audience says, oh, that's just Keynesianism. And I thought to myself, if I had said, I'll drop a rock out the window and it falls to the ground, he'd say, oh, well, that's just Newtonianism. So we have to be careful what we mean by that, by Keynesianism. And I think there are a couple of things that it's sometimes used to mean. Countercyclical, fiscal and monetary policy. If that's your definition, most countries were not Keynesian after the Second World War. Certainly Germany was not, France was not, and there's a debate about Japan. There's a lot of literature about this. Is Keynesianism the employer of last resort? Again, if you take that as your definition of Keynesianism, you've got very few countries that do that. What I think the term you're looking for is the attempt to institutionally stabilize capitalism. And you could call it institutionally stabilized capitalism, period. Because that was done in Germany in one way, it was done in the United States in still another, somewhat similar in Britain, but the ways of doing this in most countries was not inspired by Keynes. I think that's just rather important in terms of accuracy and understanding what Keynesianism is and what the post-war world is about.
Do I respond?
Yeah, if you wish.
I agree entirely. In many ways, I just use Keynesianism as a shorthand for the period of the post-war boom. I think it was my first ground rule, I said really what underpinned the post-war boom was internationalization of productive capital and the state role in economic and social restructuring, of which I think Keynesianism is a very, very small part and often non-existent part in terms of the manipulation of short-run effective demand. I think the only argument you can make for the influence of Keynesianism is to create an ethos and ideology of, again, what you call institutionalized ethos of the legitimacy of state intervention in these areas. And I mean, usually I would add modernization, welfareism, etc. to the.
That's fine. We just clarify that. David.
Yeah, as Ricardo also said, I think it's terribly important to realize how people come to conceptual understandings and theoretical positions which are very abstract based on their very concrete experiences both of living, where they've learnt it from and how they've learnt it. And I think it's inevitable that therefore we get sometimes it's called situated knowledges. I would say that the only way we can actually confront this is to treat this as actually a benefit rather than as a problem, and learn to listen to very diverse viewpoints that come from very different sets of experiences. And of course that also applies to our formations and disciplines. Disciplines, if I can corrupt Foucault for a minute, are about surveillance and punishment, as much as they are about actually structuring knowledge in sensible ways. So that's the first point. The second point is, it's very easy to, it's sometimes far easier to understand what's happened in retrospect than it is to understand it at the time. It's extremely difficult in the middle of big struggles and so on to understand what's going on and how to name it and what to call it. For example, take the term neoliberalism. Before 2000, nobody much talked about neoliberalism at all. It was not a concept widely used. Foucault used it a few times, Lefebvre used it a few times, Chomsky used it sometime in the mid-1990s. But when I wrote The Brief History of Neoliberalism, which came out in 2005, most people in the United States said, what the hell is that? But now we talk about it as if we knew about it all along. Well, we didn't know all about it all along. We're looking at our history and naming something in our history that we now see in retrospect. And it's a retrospective understanding that we're talking about. In my own work, for example, when I was trying to write about these things, I was talking about regimes of flexible accumulation or something like that in 1989. I was talking, something was changing. It was interesting to figure out what. But I think that also, in the midst of the struggle, I don't think anybody was prepared to say, we've arrived at neoliberalism, because if we were here in, say, 1984 or something like that, we'd be hoping we wouldn't arrive at neoliberalism, and we would be imagining that we might arrive somewhere else. So we wouldn't kind of say, we're in the middle of neoliberalism and it's this phase of it, because it wasn't. So I think this question of retrospective understandings versus understandings of the dynamics of the moment. Now, I think we're very much in that situation right now. We don't know. Yeah, it will be. We don't know how to name what it is we are in. And I think that actually this is kind of one of the struggles that's going on, and what do we call it? You know, how do we understand it? And what are the, take up Ricardo's final point, and what are we going to do to make sure it doesn't become, I don't know, autocratic, neoliberal fascism or something like that, you know. So in 30 years' time, we're not looking back and saying, oh, that's when autocratic neoliberal fascism began. And by the way, I think we should be thinking about beginnings. I mean, there's this constant process of transformation going on. So I don't think we should date neoliberalism starting from here. We look at a process of movement through the late 1960s, through the 1970s. In the brief history of neoliberalism, one of the big iconic events for me was the bankruptcy of New York City in 1975, when for the first time it was decided none of the bondholders should take a haircut. Everybody else should, you should suck it to the people inside the banks.
Okay, let's see, I think I'll come around this way. John.
I'll take a few together.
I'll break them all.
Okay, well, just a little comment and a quasi-question. I think I agree with you when you say that neoliberalism both promotes financialization and at the same time financialization comes back and impacts the economic and social reproduction directly and indirectly in many different ways. And I think I agree that there is a lot of unevenness in this process, both across countries and across sectors and different things. But you're also saying that this is not, well, it's not homogenizing. It's not a homogenizing process, but there's a lot of homogenizing and standardization going on with financialization as well. I mean, unevenness does not necessarily imply that there isn't any standardization, because when you think about it, one of the things that financialization does is essentially sort of like the imposition of the certain ways of corporate governance, certain ways of accounting standards, certain ways of economic and financial behavior. I mean, in general, if you think about it, like finance itself is one of the most like standardizing powers on agricultural products, for example. To make them tradable, you have to have like certain. And when you go to policy as well and those kind of things, I mean, there's a certain role for finance in terms of homogenizing certain sort of like types of financial practices as well as policy. And I should stop. That's what John was saying.
Appreciate it. Dan, I think you shouldn't make too many because the substantial issues have come up. David raised the issue of whether, not whether it is valid, but how you get to the validity of interpreting past periods. Is it just every 2020 hindsight? And then this one on standardization versus variegated ivy. I think that those two are fairly substantial.
Can I have one more?
Well, you can, but this is a notorious technique to avoid answering.
Okay, I'll answer. No problem with answer. I agree with what David says analytically, obviously, uncontestable. I think actually there's something probably common across both of the contributions and questionings, which is, in order to, the brevity of my presentation may have given lead to some misapprehension. So, for example, it's not the case, I mean, in terms of, in fact, I did spend some time situating what was the nature of the welfare regime approach, and also to see how it related to developments that we can in the economy and in social policy that we can see in retrospect, and to see why it has evolved in the way that it has and the contradictions that it creates for it. However, I should emphasize something which I did not put in my presentation, but will certainly be found in the paper to some degree, which is that doesn't mean at all that the welfare regime approach is useless, that hasn't contributed to our knowledge, and so on, and it isn't a useful starting point. In fact, the positions to which I myself come would have been impossible without the close empirical work undertaken within the welfare regime approach, which itself, as said, undermines itself in the ways that I tried to indicate. that means that we can move on, and I say we should move on in terms of our understanding of the nature of the way in which social policy is being formed, for which I'm saying, actually the expression I use, I didn't use it in my presentation, but I do in the paper, is the welfare regime approach has passed its sell-by date. I mean, it is not going to help us to understand and contest the way in which social policy is being made today, precisely because I suppose two big issues I would say was it does not refer to financialization at all. It does go around something I didn't bring up again for reasons of time, it does hover around the notion of decommodification of labour power, which is itself a tricky concept. So I actually do say that we've got lots to learn from the welfare regime approach, particularly empirically in terms of the heterogeneity of social policy across programme and countries, but to understand and contest how those policies are formed and equally implemented, we cannot remain within the confines of the welfare regime approach. Or indeed some of the other approaches taken by social policy literature which aren't necessarily attached to that. Again, on the issue of what is the nature of neoliberalism and its chronology, that's something that I put on the table, and quite clearly your answer to those questions are going to be how you understand neoliberalism, for which possibly more than anyone else I emphasise the distinctive role of financialisation. Again, something which I didn't go into was, I mean, I did mention yesterday, I think, the idea that it's not acceptable to see neoliberalism in terms of what it does for capital or its response to class conflict, because this is characteristic of all periods of capitalism. So we do have to say what is distinctive about neoliberalism, and for me, it is the nature of the way in which economic and social restructuring is increasingly coming under the control of finance in a particular form, that is of interest-bearing capital. For again, and that then will also create theoretical differences which have emerged about Marxist theory of finance and money and the distinction between interest-bearing capital and money-dealing capital. For organ, is that right? Oscar, sorry. Again, I think for purposes of brevity, I've possibly given a misrepresentation, and it's interesting that you should pick it up because I think we're closer with each other than we are to others. That is the need, specifically and concretely, to look at the interaction between finance and forms of provision, whether they are within the realm of productive capital, or, as the focus of my paper, in the area of social provision. And what you're saying is I would fully accept, and in a sense it's, perhaps again I was taking it too much for granted by putting financialization at the fore, to say that the forms which you're saying are common are to be found. Otherwise, I mean, I couldn't be saying that financialization is a defining characteristic of our era if it doesn't really have much effect anywhere. And yes, of course, what you're talking about, and many others have across all these different areas of stakeholder capitalism, etc., are very, very common. But I've got, in a sense, I'm trying to move beyond that and to say this is, however, also characterized by an uneven incidence of that financialization, and also by an uneven impact of that incidence. And I suppose, picking up, yesterday I talked about how that would happen in water, and if I picked up on housing, for example, the financialization of housing is very, very different from one country to another. Actually, economic geographers are possibly at the forefront of
I think it's very clear your point.
It'll be very quick, almost finished. But actually, the way in which that financialization has impacted upon the supply of housing has been very, very different from one country to another.
Thanks. Let me just say, the reason I'm urging people to be short is so we can have an interaction, so it's not all filtered through the center. I think one thing that David mentioned that might come up again, Ben emphasized financialization. David correctly pointed out, or cogently pointed out, that the first major step towards the financialization process in the developed world was the New York City financial crisis. be mindful and think about that in terms of timing. Now, over here there was David, and then there will be Anwar, and then there will be there are a whole bunch of you. Okay, David, if you could be to the point and cogent. I know you'd be cogent.
Well, I hadn't intended to speak to the point, but thank you for reminding me. I'd just like to make a request of the chair that earlier the chair argued that the initial presentation should be brief so there's adequate time for discussion. So to have an adequate discussion is necessary to formulate a question, a coherent question. It does take a few minutes. We don't have severe time constraints this time. We have 30 more minutes.
We have a lot of people who want to speak, so formulate your question.
But I think we have time for them. Financialization. How do we understand neoliberalism in relation to financialization? There are a number of compelling reasons to point to financialization. It involves core processes of capitalism. But I think there are a number of problems with thinking of it this way. I'll only mention one, which has to do with timing. If you believe that neoliberalism really, the neoliberal break occurred at the end of the 70s, beginning of the 80s, if you look at the US, it is difficult to argue that financialization developed very much at all before the very end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s. The two major bank deregulation acts were 1980 and 82. The result was the banking system was sent into a tailspin. Their profits fell. Financial profits as a share of total corporate profits didn't begin their dramatic climb until the very end of the 80s. So there is a timing problem. As for neoliberalism and state intervention, I think it's important not to have a straw person of laissez-faire where the state plays no role. The state must play a role in capitalism. Capitalism is not just an economic system, it's a state system. But there's a matter of degree. And I think one can distinguish the earlier period, whatever you call it, the post-war period, from the neoliberal era, by a significant change in the degree of state intervention and provision. Much of it involved withdrawing state actions that benefited labor, and there have been some extensions that benefited capital. But I think there is an overall balance that one can draw, and that began right from the end of the 70s, beginning of the 80s. So I think there is a case for that view, particularly when you notice that all of those state withdrawals have the effect of reinforcing the power of capital over labor, which in many ways is the key result of neoliberal transformation.
Okay. David has said that we should...
I want to make a very similar extension of this point.
Okay.
It makes sense to join them together.
This is the northeastern...
This is the wind. I very much agree with the timing issue that you've just raised, that other people have raised. And I think the key is that Keynesian policy promised that it could eliminate unemployment, at least bring employment down to a desired level. Keynes says this very clearly. But Friedman pointed out, or argued, that the system that maintains a persistent rate of unemployment. And very striking to me, anyway, is that it is identically, at that level, the same argument that Marx makes. But here's the difference. Friedman says it's because we interfere in competition, and the specific interference he cites in the welfare state, by the way. Whereas Marx argues that it's because this is what capitalism does. And then that raises an issue of how the Keynesian policy allied to the welfare state regime approach, welfare state approach, leads to this limit, and then the reversal of the failure of Keynesian policy, the success of the alternative comes on rolling back the welfare state, reduction of the wage fare, reduction of the interest rate, and financialization is part of that packet. But exactly as David pointed out, the reversal takes place in the 1980s.
Okay. So you've been challenged on whether the characteristic of neoliberalism is financialization on the grounds that it's actually under state intervention.
Okay, a few points here again. There may be misunderstandings, and I'm looking for compromises and agreement whereby everyone agrees with me, obviously. But
Isn't that always the case?
I think no. The first point I want to make is how do we understand neoliberalism? And as far as I understand, you haven't directly contested that, but my argument remains that neoliberalism is fundamentally characterized by financialization, and that it's gone through those two phases that I described. And my argument would also be, and this is in contrast to Keynesianism, or the Keynesian, subject to John's qualifications, that neoliberalism as a stage of capitalism could not have been sustained over the length of period that it has in the absence of that financialization. Now that raises two questions. One is, does that mean we just reduce neoliberalism to financialization? And my answer to that is no. I do not say this. Of course, neoliberalism, both as an ideology and as a policy in practice, and indeed in its scholarship, has transformed many other things, of which highly prominent are attacks on the working class, privatization, etc., etc., etc. My question is, why is it that those policies can be sustained over such a long period of time? So that's the first issue, is not to reduce neoliberalism to financialization, but to say that it is a, if you like, a necessary condition. A necessary condition. And in light of that, that raises the question of timing, of which I am much and considerably open to be challenged and to change. Which is, if that's what we think financialization is, then there is a historical question of how and when did it come about. And I would actually, but because I think because you're actually shifting the nature of what is neoliberalism to something else, it might be demand management, it might be attacks on the working class, etc., which have happened all through the Keynesian period too. You're actually disputing the timing. If you really want me to go back, and I'm glad to bring this up, and say when did neoliberalism really begin, I think, is it the creation of forward exchange markets in order to be able to speculate on pork bellies in the Chicago? I mean, that's when I would date it from. The reason I'm glad to bring this up is because something that hasn't been brought up at all is the idea that financialization is the creation of economists, which comes with a performativity view of the world. And this was, if you read the book by, Mackenzie, this is what Friedman wrote his first report for the, never mind. I'll go on about this indefinitely, but the point being, I think the first step is to establish what is the nature of neoliberalism and its relationship to financialization. The second point then is to say, once you've got that, of which we might obviously have disputes, that will then affect how you see the chronology. And quite clearly, my view of neoliberalism and its relation to financialization may lead to a very different notion of the chronology, as well as leading to disjunctures across other aspects of neoliberalism, or aspects which we associate as core components of neoliberalism, having a different timing than the financialization itself.
Thanks, I think that...
just one last point. But it's also, we must also be mindful of what is the focus of my discussion, which is also social policy. And how that's
I think that was a clear exchange about, if you can link financialization and liberalization, that implies one search for chronology. If you think financialization is not so key, then it involves a different type of search for chronology. Simon and then Sue. Yeah.
I want to make two comments. One is just a very quick comment on the exchange that's just happened, which is that the reason that financialization didn't take off so massively until the later 1980s was there was a very big technical problem of how precisely do you securitize mortgages when people are repaying their mortgages early. And it took a long time to work out what to do about that. And so you only get the development of big securitization in the housing market, which is really key to all of this, when that problem is solved. Or solved. But my second comment is to go back to Ben's framework. you started out by saying, what is the nature of scholarship under neoliberalism? And then you said, you listed six background points against which you wanted to talk about this. And then you talked about the welfare regime approach in those terms. And you talked about it in terms of what does this system of ideas, the welfare regime approach, have to say about the reality that I have outlined? Is it adequate to capture that reality? What bits of it can't it explain? How is that, etc., etc.? But implicitly, it seems to me, you're also trying to answer the question, how do we relate this system of ideas to the reality? That is to say, almost, where do correct ideas come from? And then you muddy the field considerably by raising the issues of scholarship, and you counterpose it to ideology, and you say these must be distinguished, and you also talk about policy and practice. These must be distinguished, they have a shifting and inconsistent relation to each other, and so on. But presumably, we could apply all this to the thought of Ben Fine. Where do correct ideas come from? What is it, in fact, that you're saying?
What are you saying?
Explain yourself. Read my paper.
Let me think about, can I think about that?
Right, I think, what is it, $64,000 question? You would say, I need a moment to think, something like that. Okay, Sue.
Well, my comment and question are at sort of much lower level. There seems to be a paper that exists at a number of different levels. But I'm interested in social policy. And as I understand this, partly from what Ben said here, but also I've heard him give this paper in a sort of slightly less convoluted form somewhere else.
Thank you.
He has two criticisms of the welfare regime approach. One is that it is out of date, was out of date almost from its inception. But the other is that it's built on a chimera, and a chimera being the decommodification of labour power. Then he talks about a new approach, which would be something about protecting you might look at social policy in terms of the extent to which it's protected itself from financialisation, or the state has protected it from. And that raised a question for me about, well, what would be specific to social policy in that? Because at least the decommodification approach is about social policy. It's about, if one sees social policy as about the reproduction of the working class or the state's involvement in the reproduction of them, decommodification is directly relevant to that. It's not clear to me what you would be saying that is very specific to social policy in terms of discussing the inroads of financialisation on that. And in particular, it seems to me that social policy is about the reproduction of a national working class. And I think one needs to think about the ways in which that relates to financialisation, whether financial capital has any interest in the reproduction of any particular national working class. And my final question is this also a chimera? Is it like you were saying, that the notion of decommodification of labour power is a chimera? Is the notion of protecting an area of social policy from financialisation a chimera too?
What's a chimera?
Chimera.
Oh, chimera! I think that's chimera. Who's right? We got any Greek scholars here? Chimera.
That's Italian, I'm sure.
Okay,
You should say.
It's a mythical beast of different combinations.
Maybe the central question.
you postponed one question just to get a more difficult one.
Yeah, I agree with that, I'm afraid. I postponed because I was
Microphone.
trying to see.
Microphone.
what was deep in Simon's question, and I couldn't find it, I'm afraid.
We'll come
Because
back to it.
in the light of the book, in the light of the book, I was trying to say, well, look, let's have a look at what's going on in scholarship in the area of social policy, and see what its relationship is to the crisis in the terms that we're. And my argument was, it's an art and a science. You know, there's not any direct reflection. By all means, reflect that framework back upon myself, construct how I have or have not, as we all do about one another's work. I don't see any problem with that. I don't think I'm asking the question, where do correct ideas come from? Although I do think I'm asking the question of what is the relationship between material developments and the way in which ideas, whether in the realm of scholarship, ideology, or in policy, where do they come from? And it is important to emphasize that although the welfare regime approach dominates this field of social policy, it has no connection with, well, that's a bit too strong, the making of that policy itself within the neoliberal era. I do not blame that upon its failure to deal with financialization, because I think it's got something to do with the nature of the way that scholarship connects to those who make policy through no fault of their own. I'm not blaming them in any way at all. I think I agree with Sue, because, as it were, the asset that you didn't get was about how do we deal with social policy specifically, and my argument, as taking the welfare regime approach as point of departure, is, as I said, this marriage of developmental welfare state with the what's called the PSOP approach, public sector system of provision approach, which actually argues that we have to see welfare, social policy in terms of, well, the language is a developmental welfare state, but I would see that as synonymous with economic and social reproduction, as well as being targeted at specific programs rather than ideal types. So that targeting housing policy will be different for social security, pension, health, education, and so on. So that's the nature of the approach, to which I would very, very much key social policy with social reproduction. I have avoided, not only in my paper, but my other work on the welfare regime approach, I've sort of avoided the whole question of decommodification of labour power, which I think is a nest of hornets in some respects. And I would argue to treat social policy in terms of commodification, decommodification is much too crude, because often what you're talking about is three very different things. One is commodification, one is commodity forms, which is there can be things which seem to be commodities but which are not. I mean, if you pay user charges, for example, don't necessarily mean that you've got a commodity, but that's a commodity form. And then there are commodity calculations, that is, we use systems of monetary values to make policies even though there's neither commodity form nor commodities. What I think I would then go on to say, in light of what I said before, is that decommodification is itself then a very, very complex, or commodification is a very, very complex set of processes which cannot be reduced to more or less commodity in some sense. But, to go back to what I was saying before, the nature of the way provision takes place for social reproduction in particular areas of that social reproduction, whether it be housing, pensions, health, education, or social security.
Okay, thanks.
Well, I don't suppose that would be anything.
I would just point,
The other way.
I would just point out that we have a convergence here in a bit. I think both Ben and others are saying that what Dave was saying before, that how we think about things is materially determined. I mean, we only began to categorize things later when we realized what happened. Right, Sadat?
Okay, listening to this debate, I'm not very sure I'm going to put this in a coherent manner. But listening to this debate, I get the impression that we are back to beginning of 20th century, where Hilferding and Bukhari and Lenin and all the others are discussing about the transformation of capitalism into a different stage in such a revolutionary way, pushing forward. Now, I think this, what revealed by 2007 crisis, world crisis, is that we are actually entering into a such a push. In understanding this, I think we have exiled one very important concept from our analysis, and that is imperialism. Now, talking about social policy, welfare state, and expansion of financialization on a global scale, accompanies a very, very important process, which seems like it is not going to end for a foreseeable future, which means the current crisis is going to continue even more. And that is the dismantling of nation states globally. Now, capitalism is facing with this dilemma that opening up China or bringing China into a capitalist world market, fragmentation of India, fragmenting India, these are huge global tasks that are launched from one, probably supra-imperialist center. Without starting out, we start our analysis by putting aside that imperialism and its global design for capitalism to come, that transformation. It will be very, very difficult to locate and ground what is happening within capitalism itself in terms of financialization, in terms of the different forms of welfare state and social policy. I think then we finished by saying, you have mentioned this, that you see this as a world system crisis and insulation of nation states. Now, if you look at maybe a contribution from this geography to, let me finish this, because this is important. What is happening in the world in this geography that we follow day in, day out, is what's happening in Syria and Iraq and in the Middle East and in Ukraine and all the other places. This is experienced in a daily manner. The dismantling of Iraq and Syria, and people in the West talking about not nation-state building anymore, but nation building, building that's nations that are suitable for the global capitalism. So I think that would, starting the analysis from there, that dismantling of nation-state and the aggravation of capitalism in the form of imperialism around the globe would really ground and put the process of financialization and neoliberalism on its feet. And we might find at the end that these are actually passing stages, or not passing stages, but passing tools for capitalism to implement such an imperialistic design around there. And hence, we might come to a point in which understanding neoliberalism, financialization, and all the other stuff is actually understanding a part of the elephant itself. So that's what I'm saying.
Thanks, Sadat, for bringing us back to reminding us that the world is not just the United States and Europe, Western Europe.
Yeah, my point is kind of related, but I have a different take, and although you would say that kind of third world this element, I'm going to introduce to this discussion of neoliberalism. Seen from Turkey, for example, I think both in terms of definition elements as well as its timing, I think neoliberalism had and even currently still has different kind of futures. I think one reason is that we did not have welfare system here at all, so therefore there was nothing to dismantle. But instead, we had relatively developed state economic enterprises, and so therefore, in many ways, I think privatization probably started in some instances earlier than the West. That's one thing. And And second thing is that the additional, I think, significant factor distinguishing our kind of neoliberalism from the advanced countries has to do with the fact that the way it is instituted usually requires some sort of more authoritarian political regimes. And I'm old enough to experience personally 1971 military coup as well as 1980 military coup in Turkey. And both of them, I think, instituted different aspects of neoliberalism. In the first instance, for example, though we didn't have state economic enterprises started being privatized, but the process even then started. But 1980, I think, in some respect, much earlier than the United States, as you referred to some deregulationary changes in banking law in the United States immediately after 1980 military coup. Under the, I guess, prime ministership of Turgut Özal, we had complete deregulation of financial system and banking system much earlier. And I also remind people that 1973 military coup in Chile did more or less the same thing, although it may not be called at the time neoliberalism, but what we meant by Chicago Boys and kind of a set of social policies and economic policies established immediately after that was essentially a neoliberalism. I mean, whether we name it that way or not, I think it might be secondary.
I want to thank both those contributions. It's good to have some comments that are not from the developed country. Before, let me just read an issue. I want to suggest that Radica begins at 2, and so I think that being so much of this discussion has gone beyond the newspaper, which I think is very positive, that we might go a little bit longer now, then that would not cut into the lunchtime program. Specifically, I'm going to say we'll go to 12:25, if everybody's agreed to that, because I think it's...
Can't we have the final session now?
No. And I think...
Do that, lunch rise?
Then I think if people are agreed...
Is that okay with the lunch, Philip? We go 30 more minutes?
No, 10 more minutes.
Oh, 10? I thought you said 30.
No, I said 12:25, actually it's 12 minutes.
I heard 45, okay.
Yeah. Then I think in answering those, you might say something about the work on social policy in emerging countries and middle-income countries, because that would certainly be relevant to Turkey. Okay.
Well, I'll say something. Thanks for those contributions. Let me begin with a confession, which is much of the ground rules which I laid out, possibly somewhat differently from those other than who asked the questions just then, comes out of the work that I've been doing over a long period of time on developing countries. And of course it is a wonderful irony that the policies of neoliberalism which have been imposed upon those for the last 30 years are coming home to roost in the developed world. And in some respects, having worked in development and having looked at social policy in that context as well as other developments as well, it's possible to see the nature of financialization and neoliberalism in the context of the developed world. I'm not going to, and I think you'll support me in this, I'm not going to give a discourse on the nature of imperialism, what it is, how it's been transformed, what its modern version is, what is the relation between imperialism, neoliberalism, and so on. I'll leave that to Radica. What I think is important is the way we can see that neoliberalism and financialization, or in the way in which I laid it out in the ground rules, is playing itself out in the developing world. So, for example, if we take the issue of privatization, which I think is key to neoliberalism, we find that the World Bank substantially changes its ideological position in the early 1990s, saying, actually, for the first time in my experience, confessing that it's wrong, that it was dogmatic about privatization, and so on. For me, that corresponds very, very closely to material developments and the shift from one phase of neoliberalism to another. All the successful privatizations in the developing world that could be succeeded had already been undertaken, and now the new ideology and the new policy in practice was to use the resources of the state to promote private participation in public social and economic infrastructure. And we see a massive shift of the World Bank's resources from its grant loan portfolio into the International Financial Corporation, which is... So what we're seeing, in fact, is this new phase of neoliberalism in which it's not the withdrawal of the state now, it's the use of the state in order to promote the participation of private capital in social and economic infrastructure. And again, actually I brought this up somewhere yesterday, it's interesting in the context of Ebola to realise that the World Bank's policy for Africa as a whole is that provision of health should be 50% private in the next, over the next 30 years. I mean, the nature of the things that I'm describing in the developing world couldn't be clearer, perhaps they're less clear in the context of the developed world. That is the almost blatant promotion of private capital in general and finance in particular in all areas of economic and social life. In particular, in social policy, because there's no action in industrial. There's no action in industry and manufacturing. So where can private capital expand itself now? The social and economic infrastructure, and they need the state to support that. In response to you, again, I think this is part and parcel of the, we don't want to reduce neoliberalism to, and we don't want to define it by financialization. But I do have to say, military coups are not unique to neoliberalism. Military coups took place all the way through the Keynesian period as well, not least in the Middle East, when it was felt necessary to preserve American interests. So again, I think if we look at, the area I suppose I know most about for Turkey in terms of, actually I know a fair bit about pension provision and how that has evolved, and also about housing. But in the context of housing, look around us, and we can see actually, I would argue this has got something to do with the insulation of housing provision in Turkey from these processes of financialization. The development, what's interesting, I don't have an answer to this at the moment, what's interesting about Turkey's social or the social policies of emerging countries or developing countries now is they're taking place in the context of a stage of development for the now developed countries where it was thought the conventional wisdom is this is where you start to get the formation of a welfare state, whereas now it's happening in the context of crisis conditions and neoliberalism. So the nature of the way in which Turkey at a particular stage of development, for example, is formulating social policies is very, very different from what is the standard conventional historiography of how a welfare state emerges. I'm not sure that's answering.
They would like to come in.
We've had two substantive definitions of neoliberalism. One was given by Howe, which has everything to do with labour disciplining, and then the question of financialisation came up. My own particular way is to say I think labour disciplining was crucial, but that the only way in which labour discipline could be changed around was by liberating the butterfly form of capital, which is to actually go into monetisation and financialisation. So instead of just giving a one kind of line definition, wouldn't it be better to put your two accounts together?
Thanks.
Yeah.
That's right, the other will go.
My very brief comment is going to be essentially along those lines. But I was going to answer just one thing which Ben brought up. Ben argued that when he talks about financialization being the essence of it, what he really means is that it couldn't have happened without the financialization. And I agree that it couldn't have happened without financialization along the lines that the way it actually did happen, it could not have happened without the financialization. But I consider still the essence of it to be an attack on labor. And one question that Ben throws out, one of the reasons he keeps coming back to wanting to say financialization is at the heart of it, is he says that capitalism has always been an attack on labor, and so what's different about it? And what I think is different about it is it's a shift to a more intense attack on labor. And I think we see that in that graph, where you just stop growing with productivity. We see it in the growing inequality. We see it in the social conditions of the people in society, the dismantling of the safety nets and stuff like that. So, so to a certain degree, it's a playing with words. I really do think there's elements of both. In my thing saying that at the heart of it was the attack on labor, they said it did have to have this financialization along those lines. But I still think it's important to keep a focus on that. What was the big change was they decided not to compromise to the degree they did, and they wanted to intensify their attack on labor.
Ben will need to sum up. I would like to make one observation with regard to our two Turkish comrades. It's extremely unfortunate and ironic that we would not have a paper on Turkey at this conference, because I think both of them, particularly Ahmed, raised a very important point. Turkey and Chile, where you had neoliberalism without financialization through raw, you might say, fascism or semi-fascism, and it's unfortunate that we didn't have some paper that dealt with that issue.
Just one new point, just to get it out of the way. I think Dave would particularly be sensitive to this. There are those who argue, this is to go back to my point about variegated nature of neoliberalism, there are those who argue that neoliberalism doesn't exist as a consequence of this diversity of outcomes and policies that occur, and I think that is throwing out the baby with the bathwater. That hasn't come up here at all, but because we all seem to agree that neoliberalism does exist, even if we don't agree what it is. But I do think it's important to be aware that there is that current of thought, and that we have to be within the left, and that's something we have to be able to deal with. Otherwise, I'm obviously dragging my feet. I'm more than happy to compromise that it's class conflict and attack against labour together with financialisation. However, that does raise a question. It does raise a question which I think the American contributors think they have the answer, but it's not one that prevails around the world necessarily, and that is why. Why is it that they won't compromise where we can, it's elementary economics and indeed was accepted in the first 2 years following the crisis in the context of social policy, that, let the state intervene to expand demand, higher wages, let's have infrastructure programs, and actually to some extent which are taking place, as a way of resolving this crisis. And my argument would be the unremitting hostility of capital to labour in the way that you described is itself a consequence of financialisation and the growing strength and, in some countries, formation of financial elites, where the short-termism, etc., that we've seen is the way that profits are made, as opposed to building alliances for productivity, investment, infrastructure, health, education, welfare. And that's why I put the emphasis. Again, that's why I come back to this point. Those conflicts already exist, have always existed. Why do they take the forms that they do in the current period over such a long time and in the face of a crisis?
Well, I think that we need, If you stop 2 sentences early, you would stop on a very powerful point. You know, the role of the repression of labor and the link of that to financialization. And I think we need to reflect on that this afternoon. And thank everyone for letting us go over a bit, because Ben both set the framework, but we were a little unfair to you because we didn't talk about your paper much. But we raised a number of important points. And you are very tolerant of these broader questions. Okay, we'll come back. Radika's at 2 o'clock. What I suggest, Turin, is that beginning about 1:45, we get the mechanical stuff and the technical stuff sorted out. So when 2 o'clock comes, we can start. We don't have to worry about where the sound's good and whether she can see us and we can see her and things like that. So we can start right at 2 o'clock.
And the discussion is going to start at 3?
She will go for a half hour.
She'll start at 2.
And we'll discuss her paper 2:30 to 3. Coffee break, and the final discussion. Yeah, okay. You're right.